Northlanders. Saturday, the Duluth News Tribune released its 14th episode of the Northlandia podcast, a weekly podcast that tells true stories of the unique and fascinating people and places you'll find exploring the Northland. The latest episode introduces Peter Toon, a Duluth businessman's floating photo magnet. To give you another opportunity to see what stories Northlandia has to offer, we're providing the 4th episode here for you to listen. This episode was first released on March 25th. If you enjoy the episode, we encourage you to check out all the other episodes of Northlandia at DuluthNewsTribune.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy. Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring your curiosity because here you will find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner at the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we look into how a few feet of Wisconsin ended up on the Minnesota side of the St. Louis River. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. To tell us more about this strangely historic border dispute, we're joined by News Tribune reporter Jimmy Lovren. Jimmy, welcome to the Northlandia podcast.
Thanks, Wyatt.
So, Jimmy, how about maybe start off with just explaining what exactly is the issue here? What is this? I mean, I certainly didn't know about there being a border dispute or a strange border occurrence along the St. Louis River.
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say, that in general, the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, or, Superior and Duluth, is the St. Louis River. One side is, one town, one side is the other. But if you look on Google Maps, the end of two places of kind of mainland Duluth, there's just slivers of Wisconsin. One being over at the Spirit Lake Marina and RV Park over in the Riverside neighborhood, and the other being the end of Hallett, Dock 6 in West Duluth. And they're just about 3 and 4 acres each, but they're Wisconsin and they're connected to the rest of Minnesota. So yeah, it's really unusual and honestly thought it was an error at first, but it turns out is in fact part of Wisconsin, taxed as such, and has a really kind of weird history that even involves a U.S. Supreme Court case.
So is that how you found the story? You came up with it? Were you literally just on Google, or how did you originally come up with it?
Yeah, I think an editor actually was doing that. We have a document of Northlandia story ideas, and I believe it was Barrett Chase, our web editor. He had a screenshot in there at the end of Hallett Dock 6, and he was asking, is this actually part of Minnesota, Wisconsin? Is it actually land? Is it just marsh? I mean, what's going on here? And so that intrigued me, and so I did a little digging to find out if it was actually Minnesota or Wisconsin.
Gotcha. How do you go about even trying to get an answer to this question or to look into this more? Like, who do you even talk to for that, and who did you find and how?
Yeah, so I really wasn't sure where the border actually was at first. So I went on Douglas County Land Explorer, and each of these slices of land of Wisconsin, you have a parcel, which are taxed as part of the city of Superior. And so that was like, okay, yeah, these are parts of Wisconsin. And then I sent emails to St. Louis County and Douglas County and Superior officials, like hoping to, talk to someone from whether the surveying office or, the assessor's office, someone who could kind of speak to the uniqueness of that, and maybe they would have an idea, like the backstory. And they kind of knew it, but they all directed me towards Tony Luke, a semi-retired surveyor who, project a few years ago was to recreate this, 100-plus-year-old survey of the Minnesota-Wisconsin border. And he's the expert on Minnesota-Wisconsin border through the St. Louis River, the history of it, where it actually is, the survey of it. He was a wealth of knowledge, and he was definitely the person to go to about this.
Yeah, and you and I both got to speak to him, albeit separately. You got the more lengthy, in-depth slideshow presentation with him, and me and photographer Jed Carlson for audio and photography got a little bit more condensed version of that. And he clearly knows his stuff when it comes to land and all the history surrounding it. I think he says he's been doing it for about 40 years now, but he just loves working with the land and everything that encompasses that.
Being a land surveyor, I got into land surveying because I always liked the outdoors and I liked the woods, and I was fortunate to be able to land in a job such as land surveying. Of course, land is a limited resource, but there's many aspects of land surveying, and some of this historical connection was important.
So he's definitely passionate about both surveying and the historical aspect of it. He kind of came onto this project when he found an error in a survey. He was doing an unrelated nearby survey and found an error, and he wanted to figure out why, and pretty soon it turned into a project of replicating the U.S. Supreme Court's order and survey that kind of determined the Minnesota and Wisconsin border and kind of settled this years-long dispute between the two states.
I got involved in a project for the Minnesota surveyors to do a report on the 1921 U.S. Supreme Court state line. It was connected to having found a couple monuments out in the field on a private survey project. And what started out to be a simple report ended up growing into a large project requiring extensive field search and field work. There was an error on the boundary commission map from the U.S. Supreme Court in 1921. And so mathematically, from a couple control monuments, things didn't add up. So I ended up retracing the complete survey for the 1921 boundary commission in those years.
So he set out to replicate that using those points that the Supreme Court ordered, and he found additional errors and figured out what was wrong and why. There was kind of some transcribing errors between the original survey book and what the Supreme Court issued. So the lines are right. The slivers of Wisconsin and Minnesota are not in error. They're supposed to be there, but he found some numbers were incorrect in what the Supreme Court published after the fact. So anyway, not only was he surveying things, he was also, looking through microfilm, newspaper archives and microfilm to read up on this U.S. Supreme Court case. He was going to the archives at UW Superior, where, has a ton of maritime kind of archives and early survey work in their archives, as well as county offices to track down some of the original surveys. And he was able to kind of put together not only a history of the survey itself, but also the border and the dispute leading up to the Supreme Court determining where that Minnesota-Wisconsin border is through the St. Louis River between Duluth and Superior.
Yeah, and I remember him talking about how through a lot of this land surveying, he also was able to find several historic markers, essentially, along the border here. Can you tell me a little more about that or how that plays in?
Yeah, so there are monuments out there that determine, that are used as reference points by surveyors. Some mark the border. Others are used to calculate and, rely on one monument to another, and they can kind of determine where things are based on these. And so he had come across a few of them in past surveys over the years, and then he went out and set out to find all of them. Some of them were right where you'd expect. Some of them were buried. Some of them had eroded down the sides of hills and fallen into the river. And then there were a couple that were just gone completely, I believe. And so, he went out and looked at kind of the state of those and reported back. And so that was kind of I think maybe what he set out to do first, but that's a lot of field work. And he spent a lot of time in digging through archives as well and kind of telling the story of how they got there to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And when I was there, photographer Jed Carlson inquired about how they're not just sitting out there for you to find super easily. There was sort of a discovery to that process.
When you were looking for the monuments, was it almost like a treasure hunt?
Oh yes, yeah.
Because I would imagine they were sort of not easy to find in a lot of spots.
No, there was an adventure at every monument. Yeah, and they're not easy to find.
Is it something that people can go look for, or is it dicey depending on the area?
It's definitely a mix of land ownership, public land and private land. So before trespassing, you want to be careful, And some places are physically challenging, so you want to be careful that way. If you take the canoe up the river to go look for a monument, you don't want to capsize the canoe in the process. Or, the hills along the St. Louis River are very steep, so you got to be careful along the slopes along the St. Louis River.
So it definitely seems like there's a lot involving the Supreme Court and these errors that were discovered. But, all that being said, why is the border drawn the way it is? Errors or no errors?
Sure, and it has to do with the difference between Wisconsin's definition of the border and Minnesota's back then. And that's because Wisconsin saw the border as the deepest part of the St. Louis River kind of originally, right? Whereas Minnesota thought, the border is actually about halfway between each shoreline and St. Louis River. Well, shorelines change, rivers change naturally, but also, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, by people. Entire islands were dredged out and so make way for shipping. A lot of fill was added on the shoreline to make room for docks and other industry. And that's what happened is that deepest part of the channel originally, where Wisconsin considered it the border, was filled over by industry on the Minnesota side, over on what's now Spirit Lake Marina and RV Park in the Riverside neighborhood. that was a shipbuilding operation to build ships for World War I. And then over end of Hallet Dock 6 in West Duluth, which was a furnace at the time. It's now a rail yard. Yeah, so that fill was built out, covered what was then the deepest part of the river, which Wisconsin considered the border. And then these companies, shipbuilding and the furnace, they started getting taxed by both Minnesota and Wisconsin. They did not want to be double taxed. And so Minnesota and Wisconsin kind of went at it and battled over what was the border and who could define, was this a river? Was this a lake? Was the border the deepest part, or was it about halfway between each shoreline? Ultimately, the Supreme Court in 1920 decided in these parts, it was the deepest part of the channel at that time. And so that's how little slices, 3.3 acres and 4 acres of what we think of as Duluth and as Minnesota is actually Superior, Wisconsin. As part of that, they ordered a survey to be done to kind of set out markers, and map out what they drew the map, they had coordinates, and then they had people go out and physically do that. And that's what happened in 1921, and that's what our Tony Luke sought out to replicate.
Man, it sounds like a lot of politics involved for what amounts to only a few acres of land on each of these little parcels.
Yeah, it was very political because for at least 20 years before the U.S. Supreme Court took over this case, there was a number of private cases, such as the argument around Tallis Island between north of Big Island, Clow Island, and the West Duluth there. That was a court case, but they threw that case out. That preceded in 1916, Minnesota filed a complaint against the state of Wisconsin, and then the U.S. Supreme Court finally said they could hear the case. There was a boundary survey commission in Minnesota and Wisconsin, in Duluth and Superior, that went on for 20 years, and you can read different articles through the Duluth Tribune or the Superior Evening Telegram over the years regarding discussions over the boundary and use of the river.
So now, over 100 years after the Supreme Court case and these debates and decisions and new surveying and map drawing, how does these border quirks affect the current properties right now?
Besides taxation, not much. They're not being double taxed. Those parcels are taxed in Wisconsin, and then where the border is, everything on the other side is Minnesota. So for the owners, I talked to each of the owners, both of Superior Lake Marina and RV Park, and of Hallet Dock 6. Both of them said, really, it's just kind of the taxes, and it's not too expensive. But, Charlie Studahar over at the marina, he had kind of a funny anecdote where last year the Minnesota and Wisconsin officials were trying to restore the wild rice beds along the St. Louis River, and geese were, there were too many geese, and they were getting at the wild rice, and so they were planning kind of an eradication of some of them, or a thinning out of the geese. And so Wisconsin officials were ready to do it. I don't know, from the way Charlie described it, Minnesota wasn't. So while they waited for Minnesota, Wisconsin went and used the last little bit of the old shipbuilding docks, now the marina and RV park, and, rounded up some geese on that portion, and for those to be euthanized. The DNR did confirm they used the Wisconsin part of the marina for that. So besides that, though, he said, there's a couple environmental regulation things that are different, and it's just a matter of kind of dotting your I's, crossing your T's with each state. But besides remembering to pay taxes, once or twice a year, it doesn't really affect him. He usually kind of treats it like an oddity and kind of jokes with people signing in, like, okay, we're gonna put you down on Wisconsin, and then they laugh about how the border cuts through his park. So over on Hallet Dock 6, Jeff Heller, he's the president of Hallet Dock 6. He said that when he purchased the property a few years ago, he knew there was some Wisconsin in there, and he closed on it, everything. He didn't really know the details, and then the tax bill came, and turns out there's 4 acres that he's being taxed on. He said, really, besides taxes, it doesn't affect him. He joked about wanting to open a bar that pontoons on the St. Louis River could ride up and have a drink there, but he's just joking about that, and really he doesn't touch it. He expanded the railway down there a little bit and purposely did not cross into Wisconsin to avoid all of having to deal with 2 states. So he kind of just kept it right on the Minnesota side of the state line. But yeah, no, it really doesn't play out any differently, other than it just is. It's not where you think the border is, and it's not where you think Wisconsin is.
I mean, it sounds like it gets as complicated as they want to be involved, whether it's they're herding geese over onto one side versus the other, or jokingly thinking about building a bar or something on one side versus the other because they have such different rules and regulations. But it probably sounds much simpler to just kind of leave it be.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly it. There's not really a whole lot on it. I mean, I think down at the marina there is, you can pull your boat up to it or have your RV on the Wisconsin side, but nothing really changes for you there. And then at Hallett Dock 6, there's nothing there. So really it's just the paying of the taxes. And so maybe if they were bigger pieces of land, maybe if for some reason something had developed on it, housing, industry, and there was actually structures and people and property on it, maybe it would be a different story and it'd be a little more unique. But things are pretty minimal on each of those slices of Wisconsin, so it doesn't produce much of a headache since the Supreme Court settled the dispute 103 years ago.
So all that being said, for our listeners and our readers, why do you think people should know about this? Like, what do you think is there anything important about this, or like why do you think people should know? Why you felt the need to put a story together about it?
Yeah, I think it's just an oddity, and people enjoy that. But beyond that, there's a really interesting history, the fighting between Minnesota and Wisconsin in the courtroom, a U.S. Supreme Court case to set the border and settle that dispute. That's all really interesting. I don't know if I was not aware of it at all. And I'm sure other people, unless they're big history buffs, aren't aware of it either. And so just knowing why the border is where it is, I think is important and useful and interesting. And I think that's what hopefully readers will get out of this.
Well, Jimmy, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much for bringing the story to us. So we look forward to the next time you join us here on Northlandia.
Absolutely. Thanks, Wyatt.
And thank you for joining us on this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos by Jed Carlson, visit DuluthNewsTribune.com/topics/Northlandia. You can find all of our episodes of Northlandia on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you or someone you know has a unique story that you believe could have a place here in Northlandia, let us know by emailing northlandia@duluthnews.com. Join us again next week and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're not in the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.